Thank you for the introduction and welcome all to the risk panel. The next 45 minutes, we will be talking about risks, uncertainties, and even disasters arising from the many complexities that our societies increasingly struggle with. So my name is Eeva, and I will be moderating this panel. My personal perspective comes from working as a senior strategy and foresight specialist at an independent public think and do tank in Finland. And in our panel, we have two experts representing scientific inquiry and two specialists with hands-on experience in the science policy interface. On the science side, we have Ling Wong. She's a scholar working with public risk at the National University of Singapore. Her specialty is risk perception and communication, and she has a really wide experience on topics ranging from climate change to pandemics and natural disasters. Then we have also Albert van Jaarsveld, who comes from South Africa but works near Vienna in Austria, leading INGSA, an independent international institute really dedicated to making sense of complex systems, together with a very international staff and wide network of partner institutions. Then we have two panelists who are engaged more directly with national government decision-making bodies. We have Abdoulaye Gounou, who joins us from Benin, Africa, and he's deeply involved in developing mechanisms and institutions for public policy evaluation, both from process and impact perspective, as well as capacity development and collaboration. And then we have Andria, Grosvenor, who comes from Barbados in the Caribbean, where she has devoted her career for helping people manage disaster risks and emergencies, and where she is now working with disaster and emergency management at a very strategic level. We will start the discussion today with a short introduction to risk and complexity, then move on to scientific responses to them, and then move forward to our main topic: how should SciAdvice respond? Let's talk a minute about the world we live in and how we perceive it. We have objective risks. Some risks are very evident and well known, like in the cases of pandemics or earthquakes. It's not a question of if, but when. Although in some cases the risk itself might be well known, the consequences may not. Risks are not only objective, but strongly value-laden. We have subjective perceptions of risks and what they mean for us. We also have profound uncertainties when we don't even know what the risks are. So to start with, I have one question to each panelist, and after these questions, we will then engage in free-flow discussion. But let's first open up our own perceptions of risks. Catherine, you're specialized in public risk perceptions and risk communication. From a perception point of view, what are we talking about when we're talking about public risks? Do you have any examples that you could use to illustrate us?
Thank you, Eeva. So I think when when we talk about complex risks, the first examples that come to mind, especially in today's context, is of course COVID-19 pandemic. But I think before I go into the example, I'd like to take a little bit of a step back first to get a little bit more conceptual clarity about around what do we mean when we say complex risk, and how is that different from conventional risk. And I think, when it comes to conventional risk, we do have quite an extensive, well-established toolkit for controlling and managing conventional risk. So we have things like prudential measures. We have fairly sophisticated probabilistic risk assessment models that we use. We also have, an increasingly long history and experience in regulating risk, even in highly complex technologies like nuclear energy. But these tools don't work so well when it comes to complex risks. And part of the reason is that complex risks are not localized. They're simultaneously local and global at the same time, and they have stochastic causal structures. And they have all these unknown tipping points that you just talked about. And so when we think about COVID-19 pandemic as an example that I wanted to talk about of complex risks, we see all of these characteristics play out in real time. In Singapore, when we talk about, or when we think about COVID-19, some of us compare that with our experience with SARS back in 2002. And SARS was also a fairly severe respiratory disease that is associated with the coronavirus. And but many of us actually forget that SARS was actually a fairly contagious and severe virus at that time. It had pandemic potential, and our government was really concerned about it. And we actually closed schools for more than a week because of SARS. And so we learned a lot of lessons from SARS. From a healthcare perspective, our government started to release a stockpile of surgical masks. Our hospitals started to run regular drills for rapidly responding to a nationwide contagion by doing quick response infrastructure setups. And so we learned a lot of lessons. The communication infrastructure for our healthcare system was also a lot better in communicating with the public. So from a healthcare perspective, we were very well prepared for COVID. But what we were not so well prepared for was the infodemic that then accompanied COVID-19. And what we saw with COVID-19 was a tight coupling of a number of systems that were previously not connected with each other or very loosely connected at best. So we had the convergence of a healthcare system that was fairly well prepared, interacting at very high velocity with an information communication system that was linked up with social media, with other social network platforms, alternative media platforms, all working on overdrive, spreading misinformation and disinformation about the pandemic. And so what this did was that it transformed COVID-19 from being a public health problem into an infodemic problem. Now, I want to highlight that in a recent study that I did about the relationship between fake news and the pandemic in Singapore, we found that we had a very high level of trust in the government and in mainstream media here in Singapore. And normally, typically, that would be a really, the strongest defense or a key feature in resilience when it comes to complex risks. But what we found in our study was that, ironically, that also then led to a high level of complacency among the public, where there was then too much trust placed in the government to deal with complex risks coming from COVID-19, and almost an abdication of individual responsibility. So what all of this means is that when dealing with complex risks, robust technical systems is not sufficient. Strong regulation alone is not sufficient. Even high levels of trust in government is not sufficient. And what we really need to see, in addition to all of these, is greater emphasis in media literacy, in science literacy, and in risk literacy. And I'm sure, all of us know that in this room and probably most of the conference, we are preaching to the converted. And so what we really need to see is, strategies for reaching out to people who don't trust us, who see us as elitist scientists who don't identify or have empathy for their values and their concerns. So I'll stop there now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine, for opening up the whole concept and idea of complexity, complex risks. And how about Andria? You have a passion and really an extensive career in helping people manage disaster risks. And how does your perception on risks differ when risks not only mean trouble, but really deep disaster? Would you like to also share us some example of your experiences?
I think that it's a very important matter for us to contemplate. And it's certainly a pleasure for CDEMA to be a part of this panel and to share with my colleagues from around the world in contemplating this matter. What I want to bring to the table, based on our experiences, not only in the Caribbean, but what we've observed globally, is probably this triple threat, as I would want to call it, as it relates to hazards and a risk. For instance, we have new experiences with hazards that we know. So for instance, we had the 2004 earthquake, the Indian Ocean earthquake and the tsunami. And in that event, we noticed that based on the waves that occurred about a mile in was packed by the tsunami. And so therefore we had a whole agenda around getting the information down to the last mile as it relates to warning, etc. And then we had 2011, where we had the Japanese earthquake and tsunami, and the waves and the water went up to 6 miles inland. So imagine you as a disaster risk manager, you're planning your arrangements, you're looking at the potential impacts, but now you have, in just a 7-year period of time, it's not about getting the message down to the last mile, but you have up to about 6 miles that have been impacted. In the Caribbean in 2019, when Hurricane Dorian impacted the Bahamas, you had the storm stationary over the islands of Abaco and Grand Bahama for up to 36 hours. And this again was a Category 5 system. So we have new experiences with hazards that we know. So I think that's one threat. The second thing is that we recognize that climate change is a risk multiplier. And therefore, as a risk multiplier, we have those hazards that are behaving in new ways. We're having them they're extending the boundaries in terms of where they would have been impacted. So we have the frequency increase, we have the magnitude and the extent certainly extended. And then we are now dealing with heat waves, the heat waves that we've had only recently in North America, in Europe last year, etc. These are things that are now much more intense. And I think the third area for us is looking at the cascading impacts based on experiences. So we talked about the 2011 earthquake with Japan. We had the earthquake, we had the tsunami, and then we had the nuclear meltdown at the Fukushima plant. And even in the Caribbean, we had the eruption of the La Soufrière volcano in St. Vincent and the Grenadines in April of this year. And that Soufrière Hills eruption, we would have had our lehars. And this occurred within the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we had a rainfall event subsequent to that continue to have the impacts as it relates to lehars. So these are things that are occurring. And at the moment, we are working with Haiti and the persons who are impacted there significantly in the south of Haiti. We have the COVID-19 pandemic. They were impacted by the 7.2 earthquake only 1 week ago. And they have, subsequently to that, they had the impact from Tropical Storm Grace, which would have caused flooding and so on. So we have these cascading impacts and experience. So we call this the triple threat of what we are seeing with hazards, which really takes a different look at risk altogether. And as science, this level of uncertainty on how hazards will behave, it is going to call upon us to unlock how these things will operate, and therefore the use of the imagination of how these impacts can occur is going to be an important dimension for science to address as it relates to addressing risk. Thank you.
Muted.
Eeva, you're muted.
You are muted, Eeva.
Sorry, I was muted. I'm sorry. Very interesting. You both brought up the topic of knowledge flows and information and not only from the perspective of the type of science and media literacy that is needed in complex risk, but also the very practical problems of getting the necessary information through when dealing with really acute hazards and disasters. So thank you for those perspectives, and I'd now like to sort of move on to the scientific responses. And Abdoulaye, you have a very sort of extensive experience on working with and advising top-level government officials and politicians in Benin and in developing policy evaluation. When we talk about policy evaluation or impact evaluation, we very often tend to sort of look backwards and think about existing policies and existing impacts. But how can policy evaluation respond to risks and uncertainties which have not yet realized, but which sort of lurk somewhere in the future?
All right, thank you, Eeva. In our context here in Benin, policy evaluations can help a government to deal with complex risks. Recently, we found in our area here the impact of climate change, and the government must take action to address the situation. So the policy in that area regarding agriculture, regarding energy, regarding water policies. So we have to raise information after analyzing the impact of climate change. So evaluations help government to raise those information and integrate them in terms of use of data and evidence to fine-tune the policy in different areas of the nation. We also see how new technologies can be seen here as a complex risk, because new technologies goes very fast in terms of impacting our planning here, the way the government addresses the different problems of the countries, and how new technologies are coming to influence and impact our planning and programming. So evaluation help the government to make better policies, integrating how new technology and the faster they are coming in people's life can be a risk if the government is not aware of all those new informations. We also deal with, in our context, we also deal with terrorism. Terrorism provoke great migrations, and populations are leaving their natural places to other places, and that is make very complicated for government to apply the policies, the way they are addressing the population's problems with the newcomers from other areas, sometimes from other countries. They are coming because of those terrorism. That is a new phenomenon that it's not currently in our life. So evaluation of those situations, raise information and produce evidence to help government taking another policies to address the difficulties of the population. In the other end, we see the way desertifications of the forest are being destroyed by the heat coming from the desert. And that is also a risk, but a complex risk because all the components of those risks are not really understood fully by the government. So scientists' reflection on those situations help government to get information from evidence produced by our researchers and also the evaluators of the country, and produce data information that are integrated in policy making to address all the needs of the population to improve their life here.
Okay, thank you, Abdoulaye. And Albert, as you lead an international organization devoted to analyzing complexity, which is sort of in the heart of risks and uncertainty. So if we think about the huge amount of different complex risks that our societies are potentially faced with, is it really realistic for science to assess all of them and all their potential consequences when everything is connected to everything? Or is there some new, what type of new approaches can we expect from science to deal with this new type of complex risks?
Mutaritis strikes again. Okay. Thank you, Eva. I think the issue of complex risks and what we're increasingly referring to as compound risks, because I think these are the things that are cumulative, as so nicely described by Andria, is an area of work that science is certainly applying itself to. Yes, it is impossible, I think, to avoid all disasters and all kinds of natural phenomena that are going to affect society. I think as a society, we can have a sense of which particular risks are of a particularly high probability in certain parts of the world, and we can focus our efforts and our analysis on those, but there were always going to be the surprises. And I think in this context, one of the interesting things that's come out of the scientific world is that the notion of resilience and how we respond to these crises when they happen is that we need to understand that resilience, the term itself, has developed and evolved over time. It is not just about returning to a previous state and hopefully resetting the thermostat. The idea is that to use these unfortunate events to move society forward, to make sure that these unfortunate events are used as a springboard to lead us to improved outcomes for society and lead us to more desirable states, so that there's a very strong developmental and a co-benefit that emerges from the way that we respond to these crises and disasters. But this also means that we have to adopt a systemic approach in dealing with disasters and risk and the resilience response, because what we want to make sure is that in the way that we respond, we try and ensure the triple dividends of increased resilience actually are harnessed and actually societies can benefit from that in the best possible way. And the triple dividends include, of course, avoiding at least some damage and loss, if at all possible. And we can only do this for known risks and ones we're more familiar with. But we also, at the same time, in the way that we respond to disasters, and is to make sure that we unlock and secure the socioeconomic potential of a particular society in order to deal with the consequences of what's happened, but also at the same time to position themselves better for dealing with future hazards. And so we must make sure that we generate societal developmental co-benefits. And this means that the recovery response is really, really important And that's the kind of resilience that we want to build in society, so that when these disasters occur, it is not just a question of resetting to where we started off, but it's a question of moving society forward. Now, the problem with the science of resilience and how it develops and how it can inform public policy is that it's only useful if the science is timely. In other words, it happens and comes around and allows society to respond. Of course, secondly, is that the advice is actually used by policy and decision makers. We've seen a lot of negligence in this space over the last couple of years. And it's really, really important that when we think about the responses to these disasters, that a multilateral cooperative effort is required to deal with these problems. It really does mean adopting a global perspective and adopting a holistic perspective in terms of the way we respond. Where we fail and there's no cooperative response or a strong multilateral response, the bottom line is we tend to steer towards lose-lose outcomes. And may I just here point us towards the recent COVID vaccination rollout efforts in this regard to demonstrate what happens when we can't get our acts together. There's been a lot of talk about stronger global interventions around risk and hazard management around the world. There's been some talk about establishing bodies such as a Global Commission on Resilience within the scientific community and the policy community. There's also been talk about establishing a Sustainability Security Council for non-military matters and issues around the world. And I think these kinds of conversations are important, and they'll give us some sense as to how we can collectively better manage hazards and risks into the future. And at the same time, I think we also have to think about the financial instruments and the measures that we put in place to deal with these. Many countries have now managed to take many of the insurance and market-based instruments that are available on board to try and take the financial pressures out of the national fiscus and place them in the kind of market instruments that can actually secure and support societies when these hazards occur. Not all nation states have managed to do so, and I think the good examples exist and should be used more broadly in terms of making sure that when we position ourselves for resilience, we truly are more resilient and can respond in a more elastic, but also in a positive developmental direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Albert. We really have an interesting scene set here, ranging from local issues, global issues, looking at both risk assessment, impact assessment, and resilience studies. So we're really looking at immerse and challenges for the science community to come in and give their input in science policy advice. But how about science policy advice, the mechanisms, the ways of conducting and engaging in science policy advice? How do risks and complexities really challenge the present science policy advice approaches that we have, when it's not just about informing policymakers, but really engaging? So now I'd like to invite you into a free-flow discussion and in any new perspectives to science advice approaches. What would you like to see happen? Just start freely. Who would like to start to comment on that? So just, you don't need to raise your hand, you can just discuss freely. But Albert, please, just give it a go.
Thank you, Eeva. I'll start. I think that the most important issue is that, and I think this has been raised by Peter Gluckman in a recent report that's INGSA related and therefore very appropriate for the conversation that we're having today, is that one of the major shifts that's required to strengthen this relationship between science advice and governance is, on the one hand, that governments need to adopt a much more stronger risk approach to governing in general, and not just simply think that job is to develop policies and to guide society in a very steered and I guess a linear fashion, but they actually have to consider what the risks are that they need to be tackling and dealing with as a government, and engaging with the necessary science advice to make sure that they protect society, that they buffer society, and that they build resilience in terms of the responsiveness to those particular risks that are likely for society to encounter in the foreseeable future. This notion of governance needs to be more risk-orientated, I think, is really key and important.
Yeah, can I talk about our experience? Okay, indeed, science can advise the government to build better public policies. But I agree with Albert when he was saying that science must be timely. Because, you know, politicians, they have short mandate to when they are elected, but science take a long time to raise findings. And this is a great challenge that I have here in my country. I have to take a long time to produce evidence, to produce data, and the politicians have no time to wait for me because before taking the policies, before taking action to address people's problems. So effectively, we can do something to help government. And what we are doing here in Benin is first to democratize science findings, because most of the time science findings are too technical and politicians cannot read and understand and take it to his account to make policies. So if we want science to advise politicians and government, we must democratize the terms we use in our productions to make it very simple, so understandable by everyone. That is one thing. The second is to work hard to be timely with what a politician can expect from science. Otherwise, they won't use science productions, even evaluation productions, to make policies. So we have something to do at that side to match with what politicians are waiting from scientists. And in our experience in Benin here, we try to put in place the help desk that synthesize scientist productions, make it very easy to be used by the politicians, and that's increase the evidence use and the data use coming both from science and evaluations, and help politicians to build fair policies to address people's problems here in Benin.
Thank you, Abdoulaye. I think you sort of touched upon the old wisdom that it's too late to create a network when you really need one.
Yeah.
And how about Catherine and Andria?
Yeah, if I can.
Sure.
Okay, so thank you so much. I thank you so much for those interventions from Benin, because I think that you are sort of tacking on to one of the contributions that we want to make in this segment as it relates to having this polycentric approach, where we have a way to govern our risk, which involves multiple governing authorities at different scales, and we can have them engage across the multiple scales from well, you've talked about at the government level and how the help desk is helping a particular segment, but we certainly need to build on that and to have this work going from across the government, but we're looking at the multisectoral engagement. We're looking also at the maybe parish or whatever jurisdictions level and down to the community, because we need to have a way in which we are really engaging our actors. And if I can just build in two ways with this point, we think that if we're bridging the gap between the science and, as you said, sometimes the information may be a little bit too technical, we need to, whilst we have our think tanks, we can have our think tanks that are able to allow us not only to feed the scientific community, but to be able to pull that information in a way that will allow us to share some of that information with the public. Because there's a need for the understanding of the complex interactions of hazards, whether they're natural or man-made, with the social, the environmental, the political, and the economic factors, because we know that these are linked to development and that there are many of these things that are driving risks. But the feedback from the people who are affected becomes an important dimension in helping us to understand what is happening and then to be able to provide the type of science policy advice that facilitates the change in occurring. And I just want to bring, as I wrap up on my portion, the SIDS perspective, because as Caribbean, we're small island developing states, and we have our own peculiarities and our own vulnerabilities that really and truly characterize us. And so therefore, as we look at this, we need to have the application in a way that takes into account an integrated risk governance approach to tackle, for instance, disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation that accounts for our particular nuances as SIDS, our adaptive capacity, and as you would have put on the table, Albert, having that systemic approach that allows us to address the complexities and the interconnectedness of the socio-economic environmental systems. And science can help us to do that. I can say that we have engaged a resilience approach in the Caribbean that is seeking to allow us not only to build back better, but also to bounce forward. And I think Albert did sort of try to pull this point out for us, and he did it so well, because the bottom line is that we do not only just want to build back better, but we want to reduce vulnerability. We want to reduce susceptibility to those hazards, because we know that there's this uncertainty about how they will behave in the future, that we need to ensure that we are building resilience across the sectors and across communities for development. Thank you.
Thanks. I think I'll maybe just follow on from Andria's comments, and I'd like to come back to a little bit to some of the points that Abdul raised. I think it's important for us to recognize that when we talk about science and the relationship, the interface between science and policy, is that there's not just one science. There are many, many sciences, and there's a hierarchy of knowledge in this science that we talk about. And there are all these assumptions that are built into the way we do these different sciences about what is at risk and why does it matter. And so that's why I think it becomes so problematic when we are talking about the science policy interface, because when that science goes to the policymakers, even if you make it into a non-technical language, you democratize the terms, the politicians have to sell it to their populations, to their electorate. And what we've seen time and again is that the science is there. People acknowledge climate change is a big problem. It's an existential problem. But when it comes to public support for specific policies to deal with climate change, time and again, they refuse to support those policies. The question is why? There's so many reasons, from a sociological perspective, there's been so many reasons to explain why, in spite of the fact that the science is robust and the public is aware of the science, they still do nothing and they still refuse to support policy. And in addition to that, I would say that because so what does this mean, right? So if we do not address and recognize that there's a hierarchy of knowledge in the science, that science makes certain assumptions about what is valuable and what needs to be protected, then there has to be a negotiation with and a dialogue with the public about how do we draw a balance between protecting these scientific entities that we feel, environmental entities that we feel need to be protected for the longer survivability of humanity, in contrast with trading off with what the public currently needs. We need job security, we need livelihoods. Developing parts of the world want to develop. There's that triple dividends that Albert talked about. So there needs to be a negotiation between not just science and policy, but also science and society. And you add to that mix the fake news and the epidemic from disinformation. If we do not address the hierarchy of knowledge and the hierarchy of values, the inequalities in terms of whose values are at risk, then we will only be feeding, fanning the flames of disinformation, which would push the public even further away from the science and good policy that is based on the science.
Thank you, Catherine, for raising up the top issue of values. And I would also like to bring out that in many cases, also each scientist emphasizes those risks that he or she investigates, and there's a competition over attention on different types of risks. So that's also one side of the coin. And on the other side, we have a multitude of public values and how they evaluate the risks. So it's really a very sort of a very, very challenging environment for policy advice to work with. Now we're gradually moving towards the end of the panel discussion, and I would like to ask each of you panelists to just sort of try to formulate your main message to the watchers just in one or two sentences. What is your suggestion on science of policy advice when dealing with complex risks? If I could have short notions from each of you. What is your main message? Maybe Albert, you would like to begin.
Okay.
or Andria, anyway.
Well, I think that for us, from the disaster risk management community, we are looking to science, so it might be appropriate that I begin. So I think I started this conversation with my colleagues looking at this triple threat, and the reality is therefore that we cannot plan for managing the risks that we face from hazards based on merely our past experiences. Uncertainty is a huge dimension, and therefore we need science to help us to unlock the complexity and even to be able to address some of the uncertainty. And so I think it's important that we consider that the use of imagination. I mean, who would have thought that we would have had be able to switch on our lights today if it had not been in the imagination of a scientist many, many years ago. So I think that we need to be able to use our imagination to unlock this complexity within the science so that it can assist us as the people to be able to manage the risk and achieve our development aspirations.
Thank you, Andria. And just one sentence, a short sentence from all the other panelists. Your main message in just a few words. Albert, please.
Go, Caroline.
Okay, yeah. I'll go. So I think my last sentence is, I think it's clear that we know scientists do not have a monopoly of knowledge today, especially with alternative media, social media. And so there's really a great need for scientists to engage much more with these alternative media and influencers in the next phase. Yeah.
Thank you. And then Albert, please.
I think for me, key is that a resilient society is one that can recover from disaster with strength. And that's what we have to work towards.
Thank you. And Abdoulaye.
For me, SaaS and evidence production will be all the time welcome to advise the government, but we need to simplify our findings to make it understandable by the politicians to be used fairly to make policies.
Thank you all. I just picked up just a couple of keywords, and might not be all, but just a couple. Resilience, looking into governance, looking at the global perspective, appreciating time and anticipation, developing networks and increasing engagement, participation, looking into the diversities of sciences and diversity of values and bringing in some imagination. So thank you all, Andria, Catherine, Albert, and Abdoulaye, for the insightful discussion. And I wish you all a very memorable conference and resilience in both our professional life and our daily lives. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eeva.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Pleasure.
That was a very good summary of a very engaging discussion. Thank you very much. If you would like to explore further some of the issues we covered in this session and in others, we invite you to take a look at our satellite events presented from September 7 to 9. Visit INGSA2021.org for more details.